for our purposes, hearing from a journalist who has not only covered this issue, but who has lived it in a very intense kind of manner, I think will offer us some insights that'll be very important to us as we move forward in understanding this issue and covering it. So you can read Peter's bio on the schedule. Very impressive journalistic background. He was on the Spotlight team with the Boston Globe. This is someone who has some high-level insights into this, and you received as your homework links to the 2 Pro-Publica stories. So I'm looking forward to hearing Peter's presentation, and I hope that you are as well. So Peter, take it away.
Thank you. Nice to be here. I actually think, and it's hinted at in what Rachel said, that I was invited because I'm a specimen. And the first way in which I'm a specimen was demonstrated by the fact I gave you those handouts. Of course, I didn't get my slides done until an hour before I got here, so I have to have a deadline. I'm a reporter. I'm a specimen because I'm over 70 and have had some of the small infirmities and embarrassments and insults of being over 70. And I finally am a specimen in that I put together a really nasty track record of ending up data in my own stories. In this case, with age discrimination, I'd argue, but it's not the only time. So I have 4 aims in today, and I'm going to try to move fast through this. The first is to give you a bit about my winding path to my current august age. I will try to do that without either over puffery or maudlinness. I want to talk to you about where the law stands on age discrimination. I want to talk to you about a coverage project that grew out of my experiences. And I want to talk very broadly and quickly about what I think it means about how you should go about doing age coverage. My path is that I started at New York State's smallest daily newspaper, the Catskill Daily Mail, circulation 4,007 in 1975. Went from there to some farm team papers, the Boston Globe, the LA Times. In 2004, working at the same establishment as Sonny Efron, I did a series for the LA Times about economic risks being shifted from the broad shoulders of business and government to the backs of working families up and down the income spectrum, causing huge household income swings and therefore greater danger of being caught out and snuffed. 2006 to 2009, I was a visiting fellow at the Urban Institute. When Sonny and my paper went bankrupt, I dashed into the Obama administration, first at Treasury and then on the first implementation team of the Affordable Care Act. I tell you all of this by way of saying I had a pretty good resume, you know. So as we come up on the events that we're going to talk about with my experience, keep that in mind. In 2008, my wife, Robin Toner, who was the chief political correspondent for the New York Times, and the mother of our twins, died of cancer. And lo and behold, one of the very ways in which I showed how income volatility can really hurt a family, that way was asking for any given year what fraction of families suffered a 50% decline in income or more. Our family suffered a 50% decline in income. Robin and I made the exact same amount. As I said, I went into Treasury and HHS and then on to a Bloomberg-funded startup. My twins grew. They got into really good and really expensive colleges, early decision in December of 2014. And on the week they went to college, in September of 2015, I was laid off. Now, I was cocky as could be. I have a great resume. I really did perfect what was then the first Skype interview before they would like bring you to a campus or bring you to a place. They would do, and before Zoom, they did Skype. And I then never heard from people. So I was out 15 months, and 15 months where I basically bought the most expensive thing I have ever bought in my life, which is college education for 2 kids at once. So we'll come back to that storyline in a minute. I want to turn to the issue of the law on age discrimination. The fundamental law was passed in 1967. It's the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. Age was originally going to be among the protected categories of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. There was some dispute about whether or not they needed to add a few exceptions. And so the 64 Act orders the Department of Labor, the Secretary of Labor, to do a study. And in fact, the study appeared in 65 and the law was passed in 67. And there are some exceptions in this protected category that there are not in the case of race, gender, religion, ethnicity. Among them, the so-called ROFA, reasonable factors other than age, and bona fide occupational qualification. Think of ROFA as basically an airline pilot, a police officer, somebody who has to do might have to do very energetic stuff very, very quickly. The law essentially allowed for that kind of discrimination. From the late 60s until the early 90s, the ADEA was treated as one of 2 peas in a pod with the Civil Rights Act. Literally, when there was a ruling about the 64 Civil Rights Act and the court said X was so, it was simply assumed by the courts and lawyers and Congress that X was also so for the ADEA, for the age discrimination law. And in addition to that, Congress passed a series of laws that expanded the protections for older workers, including, for the most part, banning mandatory retirement. You'll still see mandatory retirement in some partnerships, but in general, it was banned. And in 1991, substantially expanding the requirements on employers to provide age data, particularly in layoffs, and we'll come back to that. Since the early 90s, increasingly conservative courts have peeled the 2 laws apart and expanded exceptions and, most importantly, shifted the burden of proof. In 1983, the Supreme Court ruled that an employer did not discriminate in firing a 62-year-old worker weeks before he was eligible for his pension, reasoning that pensions are based on length of service and not age. Although there's a pretty close correlation. In 2009, Justice Thomas, writing for the, there were several cases in between, multiple cases in between, both at the Supreme Court level and at the appeals court level that weakened the law. In 2009, Justice Thomas, writing for the majority, basically raised the burden of proof for age discrimination beyond those for race and all other types of bias, and essentially, arguably, beyond the logical ability to prove. You had to prove a negative, which is you had to prove that there was no other factor than age involved in a negative employment decision. Pretty hard. The 2 other trends that are law-related that have affected age discrimination, one is the essentially ballooning of arbitration. If you go back and look at where the notion of arbitration came from, it was a 1925 law that was built around a narrow range of business decisions, business disputes that the Congress said you don't have to take before, if you can take before a private party to decide. Basically, the courts have the Supreme Court has bought the argument that we ought to use arbitration to relieve the pressure on overburdened courts, and it's spread everywhere. I mean, every app you put on your phone, you have to click the conditions, and in those conditions, it almost certainly says if you have a dispute, you have to go to arbitration. And the vast majority of employers now require you to sign an arbitration agreement, an agreement that you waive the right to go to court to seek legal redress, and you will do it through a private, confidential, individual arbitration. And that is the other, that last characteristic is the other trend in the law. It's called class action waivers. It's the individual part of what I just said. You can't join with other workers to seek redress, even if they are similarly situated as you, for example, laid off. I point out here that in a Supreme Court hearing on waivers, Justice Breyer observed that distinguishing workers' rights to band together as a legal class would cut out, as he said, the entire heart of the New Deal. So that's where we are in the law. So let me go back to the origins. Let me go back to my story, which I so love. The question I had to face after being out 15 months is, was it me or was it something else? And you won't be surprised to hear that I decided it was something else, and that was age discrimination. I did a bunch of fundraising, including from, I think, the people who are paying you to be here today, and took it to Pro-Publica. So I was a self-cleaning oven. I not only did the coverage, I paid for the coverage. In the early going, I did what most reporters, investigative reporters do. You do a bunch of situationers and you wait for the big break. You wait for the tip, the document that's going to be leaked. And it didn't come. So a young reporter who was doing basically social media for Pro-Publica said, well, why don't you write about yourself? And so I did a one-pager telling the very story I've told you under the headline, "Over 50, looking for a job? We'd like to hear from you," and had a short questionnaire. We got hundreds and hundreds of responses. And it was clear that the heavy half was tech, and particularly IBM, and as it turns out, Intel too. So we did another social media blast and said, tell us more, right? First 1,000, 1,400, I think ultimately over 2,000 people we heard from. And we had, this was a much longer questionnaire. We knew about their age. We knew about their work history. We knew, very importantly, where they were in the company, okay? I have to say, I've never done an investigative piece with 1,000 sources. And so it was pretty daunting at the beginning about what we should look at. It was doubly daunting in that I have to tell you about IBMers. They believe what the company has told them for decades, that IBM is not a company, it's a cause. And its cause is to make the world better. And so they not only believed that, but they basically imbibed all of the jargon. They would not talk about layoffs. They talked about resource actions. And just learning the basic language was a big challenge. We were helped because we started seeing patterns. And the baseline pattern, the baseline theme is here we were, the great, the august data information company giving no information. These people were blind to why they were laid off, who was laid off with them, was there any pattern? Now I want to remind you, I talked about 1991 and strengthening of the ADEA. The ADEA, as strengthened by the Older Worker Benefit Protection Act, specifically requires companies doing layoffs to identify not the names of the people, but the positions being emptied, and the age of the holders of those positions for every worker 40 and over. Turns out IBM had just stopped providing that in 2014. We also saw patterns about what the company was the few things the company was telling workers. For example, oh, you can apply for other jobs in the company. And I don't think in the 1,000 and then 1,400 and 2,000, we ever heard a story about somebody who actually got another job, right? They were always said, you're going to be laid off in 3 months, you can apply for other jobs, and then they got timed out and got laid off. And going back to this issue of knowing about these people, it was crucially important that we knew where in the company they were. IBM, I don't know whether it's still this way, has had what was called a crosshatch organization, so that there'd be a unit, software and development, but it would have a dotted line to another unit, like global applications, global solutions, and so trying to figure out what happened was we would repeatedly find things that we thought were age discriminatory behavior, and we'd call up IBM and they say, well, that isn't maybe it happened once, but I said, well, but because we knew where people were in the company, we could say, well, it happened in global solutions, and it happened in hardware, it happened in your mainframe division, it happened, we ended up being able to look across 10, 11 stovepipes and find the same pattern. And when you said, oh no, that only happened by happenstance here, and you can see it elsewhere, it's very, very encouraging. And finally, the documents did start coming in, and I have to say I've never seen larger spreadsheets. I mean, IBM documented the bejesus out of things. I mean, you would have a person's name, and you could see across, 145 columns, what units they'd been in, what their disposition was, whether they're going to be laid off or not, whether their job was going to be offshored. And you could also see their job ratings, by their immediate supervisor, by their unit supervisor. So we actually put together performance, Okay, so now we know these people are marked for layoff, and here's their job performance. And some of the stuff was perfectly obvious what we found. I mean, you got points, and points protected you from layoff if you hadn't been in a job for a very long time. So you've just skewed everything to the newest hires because they hadn't been in a job for a very long time. But other stuff, you couldn't tell. So we ended up setting up a grid, and you could see that the longer people were there, the fewer points they got. Indeed, people after, I think, from 15 years tenure to 30, I can't remember the sample. It's in the story, had 0 points. They had no protection whatsoever. We estimated, so we had a great deal of information about layoffs, but there were lots of other things going on. I mean, the next slide, the findings. I mean, as I say, IBM denied laid off workers the information that the ADA requires them to provide. They tilted these layoff assessments against older workers, even when they were rated highly. They labeled job cuts retirements. This is a really nasty thing to do on a double count. One, although the law in the United States is weak on this, layoffs above a certain size within a unit require public disclosure. Remember in the 80s when we had all the plant shutdowns, the manufacturing plant shutdowns, we passed a series of laws that said basically you have to at least disclose. The idea was you have to let state and local unemployment agencies know that there's a huge wave of people coming. So there are these disclosure requirements. So number one, by relabeling layoffs retirements, they got out from under disclosure requirements. But they also meant that these people were not eligible for unemployment benefits. They were retired. Retirement under the law is voluntary. Our estimates were way low. You can see in the stories how we came to them. So, company said they don't discriminate on the basis of age, and they're still saying that to this day. The question after the IBM story is, after all, IBM is a century-old company in an industry that's changing rapidly. Is it a one-off? You could make a good argument that it's a one-off, right? I mean, this is a company that had to cope with the likes of Google and Facebook and Amazon all coming down on it at once. Or is there something larger going on here? I have to tell you as an aside, one of the reasons why I've always thought that there was something larger going on is that the AARP on a regular basis, 2013, I think, and since, it does these surveys of older Americans who say, by vast numbers, 2/3 of respondents say they either have been discriminated against in work or they know people who has. Now, either there's something cooked about their questionnaire, or there's something big going on that you can get those numbers. So we tried to find another way to go at the subject and look beyond IBM at broadly the American workforce. And some of the charts you were shown by Beth are based on the very place we looked for information. The health and retirement study supported by NIH and Social Security Administration, among others, maintained by the University of Michigan, is, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, essentially where much of our quantitative information about Americans over 50 comes from. And it's it's a longitudinal study following a representative sample of something like 20,000 Americans through time. So you can see where they came from coming into their 50s and what the end of the story is. So I hired an economist at the Urban Institute, and he and I began to take another look at the health and retirement study. Many of the things that Beth talked about are things that we tried in 2017 and 2018, and I'm sure they've been much refined, and I'll be ready to stand corrected on details. But the broad patterns, I was very encouraged by the hump thing, because it's basically what we found. The thing that impresses me is how it drops off, right? I mean, we're taking away defined benefit pensions. We're worried about Social Security, and you have employment that drops in half in the decade from the 50s and 60s. Do you all think you're going to end up, you think you're going to stop working in the 50s? You imagine what that would do to your family's finances? We basically first divided departures into employer-driven and individual-driven, if you will. We focused on, we tried to take the people who Beth talked about not being highly attached to the labor force upon their arrival at age 50. We tried to take them out because there are all sorts of trends there that make noise and you can't see the underlying thing. One of the arguments for it is you can start seeing underlying patterns by taking it out. The other thing is, if the winners in this game, if the people who arrive in their 50s in this game lose, then you can damn well be sure that the losers coming into their 50s are going to lose too. And so we took workers arriving in their 50s, employed full-time, and with the same employer for at least 5 years. So this is a stable group. And we also required that the data let us see the person all the way through to at least 65. So we have a big run of what, again, these are not cross-sectional. This is not cross-sectional. These are the actual same people traveling through time that you're looking at, right? We looked at all sorts of departures, layoffs, firing, self-described quits, and retirements. But we, again, to try to tie a hand behind our back and be serious about this, we looked at ones only departures that had big consequences. That is to say, they followed at least 6 months after the departure. There was at least 6 months of unemployment and at least a 50% drop in weekly income, at least for 2 years. Just to say, we weren't counting the people who were, job jumping. We were not counting. So again, we brought highly attached people. We looked at only highly attached people, and we looked at people who only took big hits. We parsed out personal conditions, health problems, big changes in circumstance, spouse sick, et cetera, and then we looked. And then for those who said they quit or retired, and one of the things I want you to understand is that most Americans, when they're first asked, on the first early questions in the health and retirement study, say, I'm retired. I've trained myself now. I answer, I'm laid off. But it is the easy out. And people get married to that notion. And so we took the ones where people said, no, I made the decision. And we started going back into the microdata, the more detailed questions that the survey asked. And we basically came up with 3 categories: straight layoff, deteriorating work conditions. This is you, so people say, I'm retired, but oh, by the way, when we get to the question about what happened in the immediate period, my pay was cut, or my benefits were cut, or my hours were cut, or they once told me I had to change locations. This, by the way, is something that IBM did. They said, no, we really want to employ you. You've only worked for us for 30 years at this location. We're going to move you across the country. Oh, you don't want to do that? That's a resignation, right? So, big changes in work locations, problems with supervisors. And then there's one other category, unexpected departure. The health and retirement study asked people not only what's their status today, but what are you thinking about? What are you thinking about in the future? And we looked at people who were saying, oh, no, I'm going to work till I'm 70, or I can't remember quite what age we used, but and then saw that in fact, they departed the labor force. And for people who went against their own statement of their intention and had big negative consequences, we counted that as a suspicious, as in evidence of an involuntary layoff. As Beth said, our findings were that it was 56% of those who enter their 50s employed full-time in stable jobs are laid off at least once or leave their jobs under financially damaging circumstances that suggest involuntary decisions. And those layoffs, in 9 of 10 cases, produce hits on earnings that from which they never recover. They never recover their pre-departure earnings. By the way we cut up the data, less than 20% of working Americans end their paid work lives under circumstances that fit the dominant picture of retirement as a welcome, voluntary, and final departure from employment. We have some differences, but I'm sure Beth's are right. Education is not a real shield. We found 58% of those with high school educations experienced damaging layoffs or involuntary separations, and those with college educations, 55%. We did not see significant patterns across gender, race, and ethnicity. Finer grained work, I'm perfectly happy to believe finds these important differences. But I just say one of the things, if I had to say, which is the most important thing about Beth's chart, it's the plummet after 50, right? And that's important as a substantive thing for families, but it's also important politically. It seems to me that this is an area where we ought to be able to get some consensus. Let me here just end by trying to say what I think this means about how you go about covering age. There are 2 possibilities, are that you focus on the financial, and the financial is important. I mean, Anne, you scared the piss out of me last week by writing some pieces about how you're not supposed to have a mortgage. I just took a new mortgage to like renovate the house. Focus on, and the other is focusing on health and death. And this can take many forms. You could focus on the institutional Medicare. God only knows, on nursing homes, there are plenty of investigations to do. On personal stories, either of, poignancy or of, 110-year-olds who run marathons and seem to escape death. My take on this is that the greatest challenge of growing older is not how to finance it, and that we're not put here just to get sick and die. I think the aim should be to cover the roles of aging and older people in society, and since they don't have large roles right now, cover how they're shunted to the margins, to their detriment, to society and the economies, and to our ability to appreciate the poignancy of human behavior. And I want to end with two quotes. And let me just say about this first quote, I apologize to all women. This is way out of date, but I think the basic observation is right about the damage layoffs and discrimination in employment do to older people. Willard Wirtz was the Secretary of Labor who produced the study that resulted in the ADEA. There is no harsher verdict in most men's lives than somebody else's judgment that they are no longer worth their keep. It is then, when the answer at the hiring gate is "you're too old," that a man turns away, finding nothing to look backward to with pride and nothing forward to with hope. And then I offer one other quote about what might be lost by not including older people. And this comes from G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall is a psychologist from the 19th and early 20th century who brought you the notion of adolescence. He also is the only, as the president of Clark University in Worcester, Mass., he was the only person to get Sigmund Freud to come to this country and give a bunch of lectures. At the end of his life, he wrote a book called Senescence, where he suddenly discovered old age. And I cannot recommend this book. It is like something out of a British imperialist, the Yananamu eat their old. It's nuts. But the first chapter is G. Stanley Hall discovering that he's no longer the president of Clark University and being stunned about it. I mean, he goes on and on about how could it be that nobody calls me anymore. He wrote this: "We rarely come to anything like masterly grip, till the shadows begin to slant eastward, and for a season which varies greatly with individuals, our powers increase as the shadows lengthen." Thanks.
Let's see. I'm going to ask you something that I asked Eleanor Mueller, a political reporter, this morning on the Hill. And that is, in our training as journalists, we're taught to seek the tension. We're taught to seek the man bites dog versus whatever. And so when it comes to this issue, the common sense of providing older workers with meaningful jobs and meaningful pay and all these sorts of things and having it be a benefit to society probably wouldn't appeal necessarily to editors. They want to see the struggle.
Well, but that's easy because we don't do that. So there's your struggle. We should do that. There are all sorts of reasons to do that. It doesn't happen. Now, I think the reason why it has not been sufficiently covered, let me back up. In the 60s, besides the first one of this nation's many periods of racial reckoning, the issue of age discrimination was a hot one. Claude Pepper would not let this die. Maggie Kuhn of the Grey Panthers. This was a really important political issue, but it's lost that appeal. And I think one of the reasons it's lost that is not because there isn't tension, there isn't data. We know so little about the employment relationship that it's not only hard to prove individual cases, it's hard to see the pattern. And so it's hard to say there's a story there other than, this person had this tragic, tale to tell. But that really, it can really take the wind out of doing a story if you can't underpin it with some quantitative data.
Let's take some questions. Let's start here with Alexa.
Hi, my name's Alexa. I'm with Fortune magazine now. I'm kind of curious because you came at this with your personal experience, and that's kind of what led you to dive into this in the first place. So given that you talked to, or at least reviewed, right, over 2,000 people's stories, I'm curious, based on your personal experience and then based on talking to people, kind of what surprised you the most, if there's anything that kind of came out. And then I'm also curious kind of the responses that you got to these major stories, and if you've kept in touch with any of these people that have, gone through this experience.
Let me say two things. With the stories of other people that other people told me, particularly IBMers, that surprised me the most were just how deeply it cut. I can't go into great detail about this, but this story was originally hung on the spine of the tale of a very senior person at IBM, very senior. And I had to rip it out because he started sending death threats to Ginny Rometty, the CEO. You just can't, we can't take that chance, right? The guy at the end of the IBM story died on the road. He was laid off because his skills were out of date, so said IBM. Then they hired him back as a contractor at lower pay and no benefits. But he was a salesman. He loved the road. He loved Holiday Inns. And he died in one, right? You've read the story, like another bubble of the story came up recently in the New York Times. There's a suit where IBM had to release a whole lot of emails, including emails to and from Ginny Rometty, the then CEO, in which they talked about making dino babies, that's me, extinct. That suit is the Lohan suit, I think. It's being pursued by his widow. He committed suicide after he was laid off. Now, just from a little personal experience, I have been laid off in my current state for 5 years. There is not a day, is not a night, I don't have a deadline dream. I have a deadline dream every single night. It's what the distinction between needing to work and wanting to work. Work is so much part of our souls, of most people's souls, of many people's souls, that taking it away is a really damaging thing. Now, I'm fine. I've worried about getting maudlin about this, but I'm here as a way to cure yourself from being sympathetic with me. How many of you expect to have a pension when you retire? A defined benefit pension. 2, great. I have 4. I am fine. My kids graduated magna cum laude from 2 great universities. We're fine, but it's still it's a high price. It's not the way I thought it was going to go. So.
Hi, I'm Madeline Holcomb from CNN, and I was really struck by your take, how one of the stories that we need to be talking about is that we are not put on this earth to get sick and die. I'm a wellness reporter, so that really rings true for the work that I do. And obviously, as you mentioned, work can be a big part of not only our financial security, but our passions, our purpose. But I'm wondering what other aspects of life you think that society kind of relegates the older population to, that sort of just getting sick and dying. Is it healthcare? Is it, accessibility? Are there other things we need to be looking at?
Well, just drawing on COVID, nursing homes. There's an institution that ought to end, right? I mean, really. I mean, they couldn't protect better than that? I mean, good God, and particularly for-profit nursing homes. Rich area. I also, look, I spent a lot of time, and I know this goes against the grain of our notion about retirement, but the notion that we exempt housing for people over 50 from a lot of our fair housing laws, and that we therefore segregate a huge fraction of the population. I mean, I know they love, whatever it's called, Centennial down in Florida and Jimmy Buffett, whatever, but I'd be damned if I think that's good social policy. I just don't understand why we do it. And I just think I guess I've never been able to quite find the angle. I mean, I feel like I did a bunch of stories about discrimination in the workplace, and then I tried to convince Pro-Publica to do stories about housing discrimination, and everybody just kept saying, but they want it. They want to live there, and it just seems like bad mojo. It's just like not a good thing for society to support. So, I mean, those are two areas to look at.
Hi there. Renee Cordes from Maine Biz, the other person from Maine in this group. When you did the reporting on the IBM story, so you got all these surveys in from thousands of people and you talk about getting documents. How did you get people from, within the company to cooperate? Did you have to file any request, fight any battles to get stuff from people inside the company at the time who were not laid off, but?
So I have to be a little careful about that. So the way I think we phrase this is, I had the opportunity to see documents that came from either people in the company or who were in the company. Now, you could make a guess where the heavy half of that one was. There were a few very high-level people who would periodically call up and give me attaboys, like, really good you're going at this, I'm not going to help you a bit, but it was reassuring that somebody at the high level understood what was I was doing and we were doing and backed us. But let's just say most of the stuff came from elsewhere than inside active employees. But I just say that if you're dealing with a workforce that are techs, you can imagine they don't just go, oh my God, they shut me off, I can't do anything about it. And so there are pretty impressive documents, where there wasn't bad documentation is telling people they were laid off and having any sense of what, without going behind the veil and seeing stuff I was not supposed to see, you couldn't tell from anything the people officially received why they were laid off, whether there was a pattern, et cetera. So, yeah.
I was just a little confused about how they how they would characterize things as retirements when people were laid off.
Yeah, you think? They literally had, I have descriptions of meetings where they would call a group of 40 people in. No, I'm sorry, I did this coverage a long time ago. The woman's name was, there's a woman I quote in the story who was at one of these meetings, and they brought people in and they said, look, you have passed the 30-year mark. You are eligible for a pension. You're taking it. And she said, I'm not taking it, you're laying me off. And they said, you're taking it. And there was a guy, I think if I had the story, I could, there's a guy at the end who worked in New York, and he said, you're laying me off, and I'm going to collect UI, and he went to the state of New York, and they said, hey, fella, it doesn't say that here. I think he still works for them as a contractor. But so that's how they did it. And is it legal? One of the reasons you're not going to find that out is because these people, most IBMers are still have, that they want to dispute this, they have to go through private, individual arbitration. So.
Quick question about the burden of proof, Peter. First of all, thank you so much. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Yeah.
You went very quickly through the burden of proof, and I noticed this burden of proof issue is kind of complicated.
Yeah.
Could you say another couple sentences about how it's changed as a result of the recent Supreme Court ruling, and also what you think the burden of proof ought to be? Like, if Congress were to change this law, what would a reasonable burden of proof look like in your view?
Sonny, I knew this stuff cold when I wrote the stories. I'm drawing on things, but some of this stuff is in the story. The burden of proof, for example, for race. Now it has changed. The ruling City of Jackson in 2005 that weakened a little, but basically pattern is a prima facie case. So if you have a workforce and they just, the population of your municipality is 50% black and there's not a single black person working for the city government, that is prima facie. There is some term of art, but it's basically a preponderance of evidence for all sorts of other discriminations. Here, take that case. You have a city and 50% of the people are over 40 years old, and not a single person in that government is 40 or over. That doesn't count as evidence. You have to prove, you have to not just prove pattern, you have to prove intention. And you have to prove not just intention, and Beth, if I'm wrong about this, do correct me. You not have to prove intention, but you have to prove that it was a pure intention. A pure intention it is a but-for factor. But for age, that person would not have been laid off. And that is a really high bar, and it is not the bar for any other type of discrimination in this country that's protected.
Mayra Acevedo from Channel 6 in San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Oh my God.
Don't even mention it. It's hardly been sleeping. Anyway, I'm wondering, it seems like such a complicated investigation. I mean, how was it like a big team? You said you had financed it. Was it costly? I mean, how can media nowadays usually do this kind of investigation when we've all suffered cuts and our stations themselves have implemented exactly that policy? I mean, they bring you in, even with unions, and they don't give you a choice. So I was just wondering how complicated, how big, and how much effort you put into this investigation.
I can't answer for it. I mean, it's a sad business we're in right now. But, and particularly so for TV, there wasn't a big team here. Ariana and I basically handled the whole thing. A young woman and I handled the whole thing, and then the thing that made it work was social media. I mean, those call-outs were unbelievably powerful, and you suddenly had loads of people talking to you. Not everybody. I mean, it's not like a traditional investigation where you're waiting for the person who knows everything and has it all laid out and has all those documents, and you can just. But the plus is that it's cheap. Particularly TV. You get to a bunch of people. You say, "Hey, you know anything about this? Let me know." And you're gonna get some people who are, I mean, they call you up because they're lonely and they want to talk. They're not, they don't make practically any sense at all. So you have to wade through a lot of calls, a lot of people. What?
How long did it take?
Oh, well, that's an unfortunate thing. I mean, I think it took, we were ready to go with the first version of the story with the guy who ultimately ended up sending death threats to Jimmy Rometty. I think the social media call out with my story was on May 22nd, 2017. We were ready to go by the end of 2017. It ran in March of 2018 because I had to rewrite the whole thing because we had to peel the guy out. And then what I call the pushed out story, what we're seeing at IBM actually applies more generally, was done in December. So it's not, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months. I mean, I did other stuff while that was going on, but no big team. I mean,
Hi, I'm Lori Vallegra. I'm with the Bangor Daily News in Maine.
I'm from Vermont.
And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to, and you don't have to, but talking a bit personally, because something like this happened to you, and all of a sudden you're dealing with 2,000 people going through a demoralizing experience as well, and how do people recover from that, first of all, and second of all, how difficult was it for you to report that story and keep seeing almost a reflection of what you were going through time after time?
Well, I mean, I don't know that I have an answer for how people. Let me just say, one of the great things about being a reporter, I mean, when I started, Russell Baker was still a columnist for the New York Times, and he wrote a piece about why he became a reporter. And he said, basically, he became a reporter because the world confused him so much that he was being paid. He could get a paycheck to try to figure it out. It's something very reassuring about knowing I'm not alone. And that's, I mean, that's a great thing about being a reporter. And it's not just this story, and it's not just, I mean, many stories you feel like, wait, wow, I got company, and that's very reassuring.
My question was answered about the documents, but I was also wondering what you're doing now, and are you continuing reporting in this vein?
I am a hyper-local elected official in the District of Columbia. So, I am a commissioner for my neighborhood. So, and I would just say, I covered all sorts of things, including politics, and I never realized you had to talk to your enemies until I became a commissioner. And I have newfound respect for Nancy Pelosi. I mean,
Any more?
Hi, Susan Tompor with the Detroit Free Press and USA Today. But I wanted to ask you, was there a pattern that made you understand why IBM was doing this? Was it like a certain amount of wages that these people were getting? Or was it their pension, that they didn't want them to accrue any more pension benefits?
well, here, so I can answer some of that. Yeah. Did you have another piece to that question?
No.
Okay. So with regard to pension, IBM went to a near-death experience in the early 90s. Remember Lou Gerstner? I mean, so they almost croaked. And one of the things they did, and actually I think AARP went after them for this, is they basically croaked their defined benefit pension. And I think AARP litigation, or the AARP legal fund, or whatever it's called, went after them. And I think they ultimately settled for $500 million, and they dated, old employees to, but I mean, it was in the late 90s, early 2000, right? So a lot of these people, I'm writing 15 years later, a lot of these people were in that window. So it wasn't pensions, right? Now, a lot of them had higher salaries, and of course, IBM mentioned that. IBM said, look, we're in a really competitive situation. We've gotta evolve. I mean, you can read in the story their statement about why they said they did it. I think, and you could see the theatrics of this. So Ginny Rometty on a regular basis would do walkabouts, town meetings, and they were, and there was one famous one that she got CNBC to come in on, and it was like Ginny Rometty sitting there talking about IBM, and everybody you saw was about 22 years old, right? I mean, and look, this is a very biased opinion. I think it was a style statement. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg famously said, something like nobody over 25 is worth it. He's now trying to dump out people right and left who are older. I just think it was a style statement on their part. And what's really ironic about that is that many of the businesses they gutted, many of the businesses they dumped, take global foundries. IBM was one of the world's greatest chip producers. I mean, the reason why the mainframe was so famous, the IBM 360, was that they had wicked fast chips, way faster than the things that are in our computers today. And they dumped it. Well, we're suddenly in a world where chip making is wait a second, we need more chip making. We're going to support it with government, subsidies. They're not in the business anymore. I mean, they wiped out much of their research establishment. I mean, there are many people who are saying with chips, for example, we're coming to the end of Moore's law. There's just so much you can cram on, right? Well, what about 3D chips? What about with signals going, on a panel and up and diagonally and so on and so forth? They had a whole research team working on that. Gone. So the style statement hasn't paid off well for them, I don't think. But I mean, they're still, they make money, but they still kind of flatlining on profits. So I think a lot of it was they thought they needed to get into a whole new world, cloud, Watson, and they needed to look like Google. They needed to look like Facebook, and I don't think it served them well.
We're going to wrap this up because for two reasons. One, you're a journalist, you get us, you know where we're coming from, so I feel like the fellows will be able to reach out to you.
Absolutely.
And ask for more support. But I think what you just said about Russell Baker quote just resonated with me so much. When I think of all of the low-paying journalism jobs I've had through the years and all the challenges that I've had, maybe, I get paid to figure out this crazy world that we live in. But you, my friend, are probably the best example of lived experience that I've run into here locally in quite some time. So thank you so much for joining us and for ending our day on a very high note. So thank you.